Joining us to discuss this is Linda Kasonde, Executive Director, LCK Freedom Foundation, joining us live from Lusaka. Linda, you're welcome. Good to have you here, Linda.
Good morning, Linda.
Hi, Queen. Hi, Mazimo. Nice to be here again. Thank you.
Good to have you here. So, I was telling Queen earlier that Zambia is sort of like Nigeria. It's only just very different in certain ways. You guys have copper, we have oil. And so that rush for dominance, for authority is a big deal. I noticed something about the electoral system there that you needed 51% of the votes to be able to win, which is quite different from what we have here. But 51%, which means that the lesser opposition you have, the more chances you have at toppling the opposition. So I'm wondering why there was less talk about a coalition and more talk about Mundubile. But however, let's talk about this election. First off, what's your thought on the outcome here as Hichilema has been re-elected?
Well, we've seen a few observer missions issue reports about the election. The local Christian Churches Monitoring Group has reportedly said that whilst there is a variance in terms of their parallel voter tabulation, they ultimately thought that the incumbent, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, did win the election. However, the irregularities that they did report are quite serious. There appears to have been some padding of the votes in favor of the incumbent in certain areas. So these are all concerns that need to be addressed and to be analyzed. And of course, as you mentioned yourself, the opposition party leader of NRPUP, Mr. Brian Mundubile, has announced that he will be challenging the results of the presidential petition in an election petition before the Constitutional Court of Zambia.
Linda, would you say that the reason he wants to challenge these results is because there were interruptions in terms of the counting of the vote?
Well, one thing that I forgot to mention in my previous interview here was during that suspension period, which went on for several hours, the Electoral Commission of Zambia itself reported that some ballot papers had gone missing, which of course is a big red flag in terms of electoral integrity. And then, as I mentioned, reportedly, the numbers in certain constituencies don't add up. So, for example, in a particular constituency, there'll be a very huge lead for the incumbent on the presidential vote, and then a much smaller percentage for the parliamentary vote, bearing in mind that these are all one individual who has the different ballot papers is voting differently. So I don't know if the discrepancy between the presidential vote and the parliamentary and local government election vote is quite wide in some areas. So in other words, the numbers don't tally very well.
We had a very interesting election here only just last week, Linda. I don't know if you heard about the Osun elections. Osun is a very highly contested state here in Nigeria, and a very unique entity developed from this, where voters actually accompanied their material all the way to the collation center to ensure that there were no gaps from polling unit to collation unit. And this was very interesting. They went on with bikes and followed it all the way. So in Zambia, I'm wondering how or what mode might have been employed by the electorates to ensure that their votes didn't change from the polls at the tabulation centers.
So each of the candidates that filed their nominations in this election had election monitors who were stationed at polling centers. I believe that, for example, the NRPUP had about 89% coverage across all constituencies. And the Christian Churches Monitoring Group had fielded 1,500 local monitors to observe the election. However, the challenge is that during the suspension of the vote, the nationwide suspension, all independent electoral observers or election monitors were chased from these polling stations. And so the polling, the material, the voting material was left in the hands of the army and the police service, which calls into question again the integrity of what happened, because there's issues around the chain of custody, whether indeed those were the rightful people to have looked after the voting material. So these are all questions. And it wasn't just a one-time suspension. We saw the suspension of the vote in, I think it was Kabwe Central as well, and one other constituency, where the same thing happened. All monitors, all observers were chased from the polling station. And in fact, some were even tear gassed out of the polling station so that the army and the police could be left to man the polling stations.
I've got a very interesting list of options here for you when it comes to describing the Zambian elections. I'm wondering whether the elections were rigged, or were they flawed, or would you say that they were credible, but that they were compromised? I'm not all of them are positive, but which would you say it is?
Well, I think as a lawyer, I'd be slow to say that they were rigged, but definitely there was compromise in terms of the period before, during, and after the election. So before the election, as I mentioned earlier, there were questions around the independence and the impartiality of the Electoral Commission of Zambia itself. And just the political environment was not conducive for opposition political parties to try and galvanize themselves before the election. We saw the weaponization of the Public Order Act, which constrained opposition political parties as well as civil society organizations from gathering in public. The Inspector General of Police, Mr. Grafa Musamba himself, actually told the opposition not to gather because their safety couldn't be guaranteed. And then we saw the arrest and prosecution of several opposition political party members for cybersecurity crimes, for sedition, and even defamation of the president. So these were all worrying things that we saw. And of course, the shrinking civic space has been happening gradually. And it has been done, I would say, through legal means, such as the amendment of the Constitution through the Constitution Amendment Act number 13 of 2025, which substantially increased the number of parliamentary seats. And this was done alongside a delimitation process, which increased disproportionately the number of seats in the ruling party's strongholds. So these are all very worrying things that occurred in our country in the lead up to the election. And of course, post the election, we saw the abductions and detentions, arbitrary detentions of several opposition political party leaders who have now been charged with treason, 11 of them. And even in the run-up to the election, up to now, I think the count is at about 100 opposition party affiliates have been detained arbitrarily across, whether in Mongu and also in Lusaka. So, and these include musicians who were simply hired to perform at the rallies of the opposition.
Oh, wow.
So these are very worrying trends, and it's just a shame what's happening in Zambia.
Right. Now, opposition leader Brian Mundubile, he's saying that he's going to challenge the result. What do you think the outcome of that challenge would be?
The first challenge will actually be to get the petition filed in the first place. We are seeing anybody who's involved in whether it's legal representation or somehow supporting the opposition political party NRPUP and the wider alliance being picked up and detained. So we're yet to see whether indeed they will be able to file successfully. But in terms of the outcome, I think it's fair to say that judicial independence in this country has been compromised by three things. Firstly, earlier this year, 40 judges were appointed to the superior courts. That's the High Court, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court, and Constitutional Court. And by and large, these judicial officers hail from the strongholds of the incumbent. And there are also allegations of intimidation of the judiciary. For example, we've seen the recusal of a judge handling the habeas corpus applications by the detainees, which is also a cause for concern, because these people need to appear before court and need to have their day in court. So these are very worrying trends that we have not seen before, certainly since we returned to multi-party democracy in 1991.
Lynn, I want to say thank you very much for having this conversation with us. Well, we wait to see where this is going to go. If it was Nigeria here, it would be in court already. In fact, we have talks about the Osun one maybe ending up in court recently. But thank you once again, Linda. We'll be back to talk to you again if anything emanates from this story hence.